Hello, listening squirrels. Oh, I forgot to turn my lights on. Doggone. We got bright lights back there now. Because they're regular batteries, gotta get me some more rechargeables from Amazon. I still have my AA charger, but you know those batteries lasted for a year. I'm so sorry. I have to apologize for the reading yesterday. I read the whole thing and I thought it had recorded, but I had some stuff on there eating up memory, so I got rid of that. So hopefully it'll be better and it may not be as glitchy, I hope. So anywho, we're going to start back where we it stopped me. They were talking about the cats, which one had the had the most fits. And let's see. The mother said, Mrs. Parker, now, don't let's have arguments over your cat, said Mrs. Parker, who wanted a quiet evening to write her institution paper on misunderstood children. Run out and play. It won't be long before your bedtime. Bedtime. Walter suddenly realized that he had to stay here all night, many nights, 2 weeks of nights. It was dreadful. He went out to the orchard with clenched fists to find Bill and Andy in a furious clinch on the grass, kicking, clawing, yelling. You give me the wormy apple, Bill Parker, Andy was howling. I'll teach you to give me wormy apples. I'll bite off your ears. Fights of this sort were an everyday occurrence with the Parkers. Mrs. Parker held that it didn't hurt boys to fight. She said they got a lot of devilment out of their systems that way and were as good friends as ever afterwards. But Walter had never seen anyone fighting before and was aghast. Fred was cheering them on. Opal and Cora were laughing, but there were tears in Alice's eyes. Walter could not endure that. He hurled himself between the combatants, who had drawn apart for a moment to snatch breath before joining battle again. You stop fighting, said Walter. You're scaring Alice. Bill and Andy stared at him in amazement for a moment until the funny side of this baby interfering in their fight struck them. Both burst into laughter, and Bill slapped them on the back. It's got spunk, kids, he said. It's going to be a real boy sometime if you let it grow. Here's an apple for it, and no worms either. Alice wiped the tears away from her soft pink cheeks and looked so adoringly at Walter that Fred didn't like it. Of course, Alice was only a baby, but even babies had no business to be looking adoringly at other boys when Fred Johnson of Montreal, was around. This must be dealt with. Fred had been into the house and heard Aunt Jen, who had been talking over the telephone, say something to Uncle Dick. Your mother's awful sick, he told Walter. She isn't, cried Walter. She is too. I heard Aunt Jen telling Uncle Dick, Fred had heard his aunt say, Ann Blythe is sick, but it was fun to tack in the awful. She'll likely be dead before you get home. Walter looked around with tormented eyes. Again Alice ranged herself by him, and again the rest gathered around the standard of Fred. They felt something alien about this dark, handsome boy. They felt an urge to tease him. If she's sick, said Walter, Father will cure her. He must. I'm afraid that will be impossible, said Fred, pulling a long face but winking at Andy. Nothing is impossible for Father, insisted Walter loyally. Why, Russ Carter went to Charlottetown just for a day last summer, and when he came home his mother was dead as a doornail, said Bill. And buried, said Andy, thinking to add an extra dramatic touch. Whether a fact or not didn't matter. Russ was awful mad he'd missed the funeral. Funerals are so jolly. And I've never seen a single funeral, said Opal sadly. Well, there'll be lots of chances for you yet, said Andy, but you see, even Dad couldn't keep Mrs. Carter alive, and he's a lot better doctor than your father. He isn't? Yes, he is, and a lot better looking, too. He isn't? Something always happens when you go away from home, said Opal. What will you feel like if you find Ingleside burned down when you go home? These kids are awful. If your mother dies, likely you children will all be separated, said Cora cheerfully. Maybe you'll come and live here. Yes, do, said Alice sweetly. Oh, his father would want to keep him, said Bill. He'd soon be marrying again. But maybe his father will die too. I heard Dad say Dr. Blythe was working himself to death. Look at him staring. You've got girl's eyes, Sonny, girl's eyes, girl's eyes. Ah, shut up, said Opal, suddenly tiring of the sport. You ain't fooling him. He knows you're only teasing. Let's go down to the park and watch the baseball game. Walter and Alice can stay here. We can't have kids tagging after us everywhere. Walter was not sorry to see them go. Neither apparently was Alice. They sat down on an apple log and looked shyly and contentedly at each other. I'll show you how to play jackstones, said Alice, and lend you my plush kangaroo. When bedtime came, Walter found himself put into the little hall bedroom alone. Mrs. Parker considerately left a candle with him and a warm puff, for the July night was unreasonably cold, as even a summer night in the Maritimes sometimes is. It almost seemed as if there might be a frost. But Walter could not sleep, not even with Alice's plush kangaroo cuddled to his cheek. Oh, if he were only home in his own room, where the big window looked out on the glen, and the little window with a tiny roof all its own looked out onto the Scotch pine. Mother would come in and read poetry to him in her lovely voice. I'm a big boy. I won't cry. I won't. The tears came in spite of himself. What good were plush kangaroos? It seemed years since he had left home. Presently the other children came back from the park and crowded amiably into the room to sit on the bed and eat apples. You been crying, baby, jeered Andy. You're nothing but a sweet little girl, Mama's pet. Have a bite, kid, said Bill, proffering a half-gnawed apple, and cheer up. I wouldn't be surprised if your mother got better. If she's got a constitution, that is. Dad says Mrs. Stephen Flagg would have died years ago if she hadn't a constitution. Has your mother got one? Of course she has, said Walter. He had no idea what a constitution was, but if Mrs. Stephen Flagg had one, Mother must. Mrs. Ab Sawyer died last week, and Sam Clark's mother died the week before, said Andy. They died in the night, said Cora. Mother says people mostly die in the night. I hope I won't. Fancy going to heaven in your nightdress. Children, children, get off to your beds, called Mrs. Parker. The boys went, after pretending to smother Walter with a towel. After all, they rather liked the kid. Walter caught Opal's hand as she turned away. Opal, it isn't true Mother's sick, is it? He whispered imploringly. He could not face being left alone with his fear. Opal was not a bad-hearted child, as Mrs. Parker said, but she could not resist the thrill one got out of telling bad news. She is sick. Aunt Jen says so. She said I wasn't to tell you, but I think you ought to know. Maybe she has a cancer. Does everybody have to die, Opal? This was a new and dreadful idea to Walter, who never thought about death before. Of course, silly, only they don't die, really. They go to heaven, said Opal cheerfully. Not all of them, said Andy, who was listening outside the door in a pig's whisper. Is heaven farther away than Charlottetown? Asked Walter. Opal shrilled with laughter. Well, you are queer. Heaven's millions of miles away, but I'll tell you what you do. You pray. Praying's good. I lost a dime once. I prayed and I found a quarter. That's how I know. Opal Johnson, did you hear what I said? And put out that candle in Walter's room. I'm afraid of fire, called Mrs. Parker from her room. He should have been asleep long ago. Opal blew out the candle and flew. Aunt Jen was easy going, but when she did get riled. Andy stuck his head in at the door for a good night benediction. Likely them birds in the wallpaper will come alive and peck your eyes out, he hissed. after which everybody did really go to bed, feeling that it was the end of a perfect day, and Walt Blythe wasn't a bad little kid, and they'd have some more fun teasing him tomorrow. Dear little souls, thought Mrs. Parker sentimentally. Was she out of touch? An unwonted quiet descended upon the Parker house, and 6 miles away at Ingleside, little Bertha Marilla Blythe was blinking round hazel eyes at the happy faces around her and the world into which she had just been ushered on the coldest July night the Maritimes had experienced in 87 years. So that's the end of chapter 8, and I read it, not knowing. Okay, now we go on to chapter 9. Walter. Have a little slug. Walter, alone in the darkness, still found it impossible to sleep. He had never slept alone before in his short life. Always Jim or Ken near him, warm and comforting. The little room became dimly visible as the pale moonlight crept into it, but it was almost worse than darkness. A picture on the wall at the foot of his bed seemed to leer at him. Pictures always look so different by moonlight. You saw in them things you never suspected by daylight. The long lace curtains looked like tall, thin women, one on each side of the window, weeping. There were noises about the house, creaks, sighs, whisperings. Suppose the birds on the wallpaper were coming to life and getting ready to pick out his eyes. A creepy fear suddenly possessed Walter, and then one great fear banished all the others. Mother was sick. He had to believe it since Opal had said it was true. Perhaps Mother was dying. Perhaps Mother was dead. There would be no Mother to go home to. Walter saw Ingleside without Mother. Suddenly Walter knew he could not bear it. He must go home. Right away, at once. He must see Mother before she died. This was what Aunt Mary Maria had meant. She had known Mother was going to die. It was no use to think of waking anyone and asking to be taken home. They wouldn't take him. They would only laugh at him. It was an awful long road home, but he would walk at night. Very quietly he slipped out of bed and put on his clothes. He took his shoes in his hand. He did not know where Mrs. Parker had put his cap, but that didn't matter. He must not make any noise. He must just escape and get to Mother. He was sorry he could not say goodbye to Alice. She would have understood. Through the dark hall, down the stairs, step by step. Hold your breath. Was there no end to these steps? The very furniture was listening. Ugh. Walter had dropped one of his shoes. Down the stairs it clattered, bumping from step to step, shot across the hall, and brought up against the front door with what seemed to Walter a deafening crash. Walter huddled in despair against the rail. Everybody must have heard that noise. They would come rushing out. He wouldn't be let go home. A sob of despair choked in his throat. It seemed hours before he dared believe that nobody had wakened up, before he dared resume his careful passage down the stairs. But it was accomplished at last. He found his shoe and cautiously turned the handle of the front door. Doors were never locked at the Parker place. Mrs. Parker said they hadn't anything worth stealing except children, and nobody wanted them. Walter was out. The door closed behind him. He slipped on the shoes and stole down the street. The house on the edge of the village, and he was soon on the open road. A moment of panic overwhelmed him. The fear of being caught and prevented was past, and his old fears of darkness and solitude returned. He had never been out alone in the night before. He was afraid of the world. It was such a huge world, and he was terribly small in it. Even the cold, raw wind that was coming up from the east seemed blowing in his face as if to push him back. Mother was going to die. Walter took a gulp and set his face towards home. On and on he went, fighting fear gallantly. It was moonlight, but the moonlight it was moonlight, but the moonlight let you see things, and nothing looked familiar. Once he had been out with Dad, he had thought he had never seen anything so pretty as a moonlit road crossed by tree shadows. But now the shadows were so black and sharp they might fly up at you. The fields had put on a strangeness. The trees were no longer friendly. They seemed to be watching him, crowding in before and behind him. Two blazing eyes looked out at him from the ditch, and a black cat of unbelievable size ran across the road. Was it a cat, or the night was cold? He shivered in his thin blouse, but he would not mind the cold if he could only stop being afraid of everything, of the shadows and the fervent sounds and the nameless things that might be prowling in the strips of woodland he passed through. He wondered what it would be like not to be afraid of anything like Jim. I'll just pretend I'm not afraid, he said aloud, and then shuddered with terror over the lost sound of his own voice in the great night. But he went on. One had to go on when Mother was going to die. Once he fell and bruised and skinned his knee badly on a stone. Once he heard a buggy coming along behind him and hid behind a tree till it passed. Terrified lest Dr. Parker had discovered he had gone and was coming after him. Once he had stopped in sheer terror of something black and furry sitting on the side of the road. He could not pass it. He could not, but he did. It was a big black dog. Was it a dog? But he was past it. He dared not run lest it chase him. He stole a desperate glance over his shoulder. It had got up and was loping away in the opposite direction. Walter put his little brown hand up to his face and found it wet with sweat. A star fell in the sky before him, scattering sparks of flame. Walter remembered hearing old Aunt Kitty say that when a star fell, someone died. Was it Mother? He had just been feeling that his legs would not carry him another step. But at the thought, he marched on again. He was so cold now that he had almost ceased to feel afraid. Would he never get home? It must be hours and hours since he left Low Bridge. It was 3 hours. He had stolen out of the Parker house at 11, and it was now 2. When Walter found himself on the road that dipped down into the glen, he gave a sob of relief. But as he stumbled through the village, the sleeping houses seemed remote and far away. They had forgotten him. A cow suddenly bawled at him over a fence, and Walter remembered that Mr. Joe Reese kept a savage bull. He broke into a run of sheer panic that carried him up the hill to the gate of Ingleside. He was home. Oh, he was home. Then he stopped short, trembling, overcome by a dreadful feeling of desolation. He had been expecting to see the warm, friendly lights of home, and there was not a light at Ingleside. There really was a light, if one could have seen it, in a back bedroom where the nurse slept with the baby's basket beside her. But to all intents and purposes, Ingleside was as dark as a deserted house, and it broke Walter's spirit. He had never imagined Ingleside dark at night. It meant that Mother was dead. Walter stumbled up the drive, across the grim black shadow of the house, onto the lawn, to the front door. It was locked. He gave a feeble knock. He could not reach the knocker, but there was no response, nor did he expect any. He listened. There was not a sound of living in the house. He knew Mother was dead. And everybody had gone away. He was by now too chilled exhausted to cry, but he crept around to the barn and climbed the ladder to the haymow. He He was past being frightened. He only wanted to get somewhere out of the wind and lie down till morning. Perhaps somebody would come back. Come back then after they had buried Mother. A sleek little tiger kitten someone had given the doctor purred up to him, smelling nicely of clover hay. Walter clutched it gladly. It was warm and alive, but it heard the little mice scampering over the floor and would not stay. The moon looked at him through the cobwebby window, but there was no comfort in the far, cold, unsympathetic moon. A light burning in a house down in the glen was more like a friend. As long as that light shone, he could bear up. He could not sleep. His knee hurt too much, and he was cold. With such a funny feeling in his stomach, perhaps he was dying too. He hoped he was, since everyone else was dead or gone away. Did nights ever end? Other nights had always ended, but maybe this one wouldn't. He remembered a dreadful story he had heard to the effect that Captain Jack Flagg at the harbor mouth had said he wouldn't let the sun come up some morning when he got real mad. Suppose Captain Jack had got real mad at last. Then the glen light went out and he couldn't bear it, but as the little cry of despair left his lips, as the little cry of despair left his lips, he realized that it was a day. Phew, that's the end of chapter 8 and 9. Again, sorry that happened last night. I didn't realize it. That's the good thing about going back and checking replays. Or I wouldn't have known. I'm sure somebody would have told me. Okay, I'm going to let y'all go. I'll be having tea at 3. Hope you'll join me. Next is Advent Calendar. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. Bye-bye.